World War I is usually remembered as a military catastrophe. Trenches, artillery, and shattered empires dominate the story. But the war was not decided by soldiers alone. Long before the first shots were fired, another conflict was already underway. One fought in banks, treasuries, and financial systems. This was a war of money. At the dawn of the 20th century, the global economy was bound together by the gold standard. Currencies were anchored to physical reserves. Governments were constrained by what they could actually pay for. War, under this system, had natural limits. Prolonged conflict was difficult because money itself enforced restraint. Then those limits were removed. As Europe moved toward war, governments faced a problem they could not solve openly. Modern warfare had become too expensive. Industrial armies, mechanized weapons, global logistics, none of this could be funded through existing tax systems or gold reserves without immediate collapse. So the rules changed. Gold convertibility was suspended. Currencies were detached from metal. Governments gained the ability to spend far beyond their reserves, not by creating wealth, but by creating promises. This decision did not feel revolutionary at the time. It was presented as temporary, necessary, patriotic, but it marked a permanent shift. War was no longer constrained by what states possessed. It was constrained only by what they could borrow. Banks became strategic assets. Balance sheets became battlefields. Victory depended not just on manpower, but on credit. Governments issued unprecedented amounts of debt, confident that future growth, or future generations, would absorb the cost. Ordinary citizens were drawn into this system. War bonds transformed private savings into instruments of state finance. People were told they were supporting the nation, securing the future, investing responsibly. In reality, they were financing destruction with deferred consequences. If you value this kind of historical clarity, consider liking the video, sharing your perspective in the comments, and subscribing for future episodes. This financial mobilization worked in the short term. Armies were supplied. Factories expanded. The war machine ran continuously. But the cost was no longer visible. It was postponed, abstracted, and spread across time. This is where the hidden battle truly mattered. By detaching money from gold and normalizing massive borrowing, governments created conditions that would outlast the war itself. Inflation became tolerated. Debt became permanent. Financial systems were redesigned not for stability, but for endurance. The war ended. The financial consequences did not. Currencies weakened, savings were eroded. Entire societies struggled to return to economic normality. The instability that followed was not an accident. It was the delayed cost of financing a conflict without limits. World War I did not just redraw borders. It rewired the global financial system. And once that system learned how to fund total war, it never fully returned to restraint. What followed, economic bubbles, monetary crises, and recurring inflation, were not separate events. They were echoes of decisions made when money was asked to serve power without boundaries. To understand World War I fully, you cannot look only at the trenches. You have to follow the money. When the fighting stopped, the financial war did not. Governments emerged from World War I burdened by debts unlike anything seen before. These obligations were not temporary. They were structural. Entire national budgets were now shaped around repayment, refinancing, and monetary management. The war had ended, but the financial machinery it created remained in motion. This was the first major consequence of unlimited war finance. Before the conflict, debt had been episodic. After it, debt became permanent. States no longer expected to return fully to balanced budgets. Instead, they learned to roll obligations forward, extending maturity dates, issuing new bonds to service old ones, and relying on economic growth to absorb the burden. This altered the meaning of stability. Inflation followed, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual adjustment. Prices rose unevenly. Wages lagged. Savings lost purchasing power quietly rather than dramatically. For many citizens, the damage was confusing rather than catastrophic. Life became harder, but the cause was difficult to pinpoint. This is how financial consequences become socially survivable. Governments framed inflation as recovery, as normalization, as the cost of rebuilding. In reality, it was the delayed payment for a war that had been financed beyond visible limits. The burden was no longer carried by taxpayers alone, but by anyone holding currency or fixed income. Money had changed roles. It was no longer just a medium of exchange or a store of value. It had become a policy instrument. Central banks expanded their influence. Monetary coordination replaced metallic discipline. Flexibility was celebrated, even as it introduced new fragilities. This system rewarded endurance over prudence. States that could manage debt survived. Those that could not faced instability. The distinction was no longer about production or trade alone. It was about access to credit and the ability to maintain confidence. Financial credibility became a strategic asset, just as important as military strength. Ordinary citizens were now permanently tied to national balance sheets. Savings accounts, pensions, wages, all were indirectly exposed to decisions made during the war. Even those who never bought a bond or fired a shot felt the consequences. The financial system had succeeded in generalizing sacrifice. This was not presented as coercion. It was presented as normal. And that normalization mattered. Once societies accepted persistent debt and managed inflation as ordinary features of economic life, returning to restraint became difficult. Emergency measures hardened into permanent structures. Temporary solutions became standard practice. The post-war years were filled with attempts to restore order. Gold was discussed. Fiscal discipline was promised. But the underlying incentives had changed. Governments had learned that financial systems could absorb extraordinary pressure, at least for a time. That lesson would not be forgotten. World War I did not simply disrupt the global economy. It redefined what governments believed money could do. And when money becomes a tool for sustaining systems beyond their natural limits, the costs do not disappear. They resurface later, in crises, corrections, and moments when confidence finally runs thin. The war had proven something dangerous and powerful, that financial limits could be postponed. What remained to be seen was how long that postponement could last, and who would ultimately pay for it. The financial legacy of World War I did not end with Reconstruction. It became a template. Once governments learned that wars could be financed through debt, monetary expansion, and public participation, the boundary between emergency finance and normal governance blurred. What had once been unthinkable became acceptable. What had once been temporary became permanent. This was the war's most enduring consequence. Before 1914, financial systems were designed to impose limits. After the war, they were redesigned to manage excess. Stability was no longer defined by restraint, but by the ability to maintain confidence while carrying unprecedented obligations. This subtle shift reshaped the modern world. Inflation, once feared as a sign of failure, became tolerated as a policy outcome. Public debt, once exceptional, became structural. Central banks moved from passive guardians of currency to active managers of economic endurance. Money stopped being a constraint on power and became one of its primary instruments. This did not happen because governments misunderstood economics. It happened because they understood it very well. They had seen what unlimited finance could accomplish in wartime. Industrial output surged, entire societies were mobilized, political resistance could be deferred, costs could be distributed across time and populations that never directly consented to them. The danger was not excess, the danger was success. World War I demonstrated that financial systems could absorb enormous strain without immediate collapse. That lesson encouraged repetition. Subsequent crises, conflicts, and expansions relied on the same logic. Borrow now, manage consequences later. The echoes are unmistakable. The interwar years struggled under debt and monetary instability. Later conflicts relied even more heavily on deficit spending. Modern economies operate permanently within structures first normalized during the First World War. Inflation cycles, sovereign debt debates, and recurring financial crises are not anomalies. They are inherited features. This does not mean collapse is inevitable, but it does mean limits have been deferred rather than removed. The idea of real wealth changed as well. Wealth became increasingly financial rather than productive. Assets grew faster than underlying output. Value was measured less by what was made and more by what could be promised. This abstraction allowed systems to grow larger, but also made them more sensitive to confidence. When confidence weakens, the system shakes. World War I taught governments how to separate cost from consent. Citizens no longer needed to approve every burden directly. Inflation, debt, and monetary expansion could generalize sacrifice quietly. This made states more resilient in the short term and more fragile in the long term. Because fragility accumulates, the true financial battle of World War I was not about funding victory. It was about redefining what money was allowed to do. Once that definition changed, there was no simple way back. Financial systems evolved to support endurance rather than equilibrium. That evolution still shapes the world today. When modern debates arise about debt, inflation, and financial freedom, they're often framed as technical disagreements. But beneath them lies a historical truth. Many of our systems were forged in moments when survival mattered more than sustainability. World War I was one of those moments. To understand modern finance, you do not need to start with recent crises. You need to look back to the first time money was asked to sustain total war without limits. The past doesn't disappear, it reorganizes itself.